go over yet. Just, you don't have to go all the way to center, just a little bit more. A minute. Give you just a minute.
Yeah.
I've been traveling for a couple hours in traffic.
Oh boy. Yes, ma'am. Yes, but you don't have to see it. I wonder if, yeah, I wonder if we turned that, just angled it maybe it doesn't angle. Maybe I can push it out. I wonder if we change that angle just a little.
That's okay. I can move.
Yeah, I will have some of the highlights on it. I wonder if I turn this TV a little bit this way. Don't let me cut you off, but that might change the angle a little to take the glare. Does that help? Can you still see it, or is that too far? Is that okay? Perfect.
And by the way, let's just do a quick. Let me bring that mic, and I'm going to put it right in the middle like this, so it doesn't flop around. And then let's just do a quick. Sorry, just watch my hands. Got you wet.
It's all right.
So yeah.
Check, mic check.
So those people online, if you can hear us, can you just give Kyle? Can you see if they can give you a thumbs up if they can hear you?
Hello, can you hear me? Welcome to the SALT class. My name's Daryl. If you can hear me, give me a big thumbs up on the screen.
Those people online. See if we got it. If we're streaming. We had like 70. I don't know how many people online.
We're good?
We're good? Sweet. I guess we can get going then. All right. Awesome. You want this, Marcelo, to... Yeah, let me get an introduction. That would be awesome. So, and then just again, if you guys can move in just a tiny bit so if people come in, they can come around and get right in. That would be awesome. So, good deal. Test 1, 2. Awesome. We are getting started. Let's see. 6:30. You guys good to start? Everybody's cell phones off? Okay.
But leave them out. We're going to do something fun with your cell phone before we get started. So
Awesome.
hang on to your cell phone, but silence it.
Okay, so I have the privilege of introducing Daryl Bouchard, who's a good friend of mine who we've known each other for about 20 years, roughly.
Yeah.
Probably around that time.
Maybe more.
So back in the day when I was Director of Entrepreneur Development for the state of Utah, he and I helped business development for the state of Utah. And I got to know him really well. And talking about character, this guy has amazing character. Like, just if he says something, it's going to happen. And he follows through with things. Just amazing person. But back in the day, a long time ago, I'm going to have you guys quiet a little bit. Sorry, I need you guys to be a little quiet. Thank you. Back in the day, what was interesting is I was using, the regular Morton type salt, right? The white salt. Yeah, table salt, right? And he said, stop using that. And I'm like, why? It's like super good for you. It has iodine and everything, and you're going to get really, really healthy with it. And he says, no, you don't. And he started teaching me about salt. Now, I don't know if you knew this, but I changed my salt habit back then when you said that. I haven't gone back. And what's interesting is I'm super, super sensitive to salt. And when it comes to emergency food, there's a lot of salt in emergency food out there. And what'll happen is I'll take regular salt, and I'll know I had regular salt because I can't think straight. And I start getting canker sores quickly, and then I get weird things happening to my bowels, and I get really upset at people, and I can't handle it and everything else. But what's interesting is in the mornings, I actually sometimes I take, like you have those little, what's it called, like soups, not soup, but cereal spoons, like the smaller spoons, not the big ones, but smaller ones. Sometimes I'll just take a spoonful of that, throw in some water, and drink a couple cups of water, and then just start out the day, and I'd feel nothing. And throughout the whole day, I'm putting it on my eggs, and I'm putting on this, and I'm putting a whole bunch, and at the end of the day, I'm like feeling great. And I've been doing that today, by the way. That's the type of things I learned from him years ago, 20 years ago, roughly, okay? And it's a privilege to have him here tonight. I mean, huge privilege. He is the best, and I can say this, he is the best salt expert I know. And that's who you get to learn from today. So I want to introduce Darryl Bouchard. Take it away.
Thanks for having me. What he didn't really articulate very well, because he said he has character. What he meant to say is he is a character. But yeah, so Marcel and I have worked together for a long time. Not continually, but 20 years ago we met, and my family has been in the salt industry for a long time. And when I kind of grew up in the salt business, and when my dad said, if you don't straighten up, I'm going to send you to the salt mines, he wasn't kidding. So yeah, I kind of grew up in the salt mines, but I'm a real believer in the connection of people. And it's kind of fun to think, if you look around this room, it's a really unique group. In fact, so unique that this particular group will probably never happen again, because it's just such a unique night. And to kind of illustrate that and the mathematical almost impossibility for this to happen, I'd like you to pull your cell phone out, and I want you to show you something that's so unique about this particular night. So open your cell phone and then find your calculator. On my phone, it looks like this. So pull your calculator up, and we want to create a mathematically unique number that will confirm that this night is going to be particularly unique. So from this side of the room, I need a 3-digit number that's less than 300. It can be some meaningful number. Sir, what's a good 3-digit number less than 300? Okay, so everybody punch in 280 on your cell phone. And then that's not big enough. So we're going to multiply that by some other favorite front row right here. What's a 3-digit number? Some random 3-digit number. Below 300. 159. So multiply that by 159. So I've got 44,520, but that's not quite big enough. So I want another 2-digit number now to see if we can get this number big. So maybe back row over here, right over here. What's that? 27. So we're going to times that by 27. Marcelo, I'm going to need you for a second. Okay, so we all should have now 1,202,000 and then 40, right? But that's still not quite big enough. So we're going to have Marcelo, I'm going to have him just punch in a bunch of random numbers on my phone, and probably like 8 digits. So just reach under there and just hit, okay, that's probably...
That about right?
Close enough.
Yeah.
Okay, so add, hit the add button. 41,723,596. Okay, one more time. 41,723,596. And then go ahead and press enter. Okay, I'd like you to take a screenshot of that number and think about how unique this number is. So today is April, which is what month? Okay, what day is it today? So look at that number. The very first number is 4. 29. What year is it? And what time is it 1 minute ago when you took that screenshot? So if you look at that screenshot, it'll say 6:36, which is so unique that we're here together this night. And as a combination, including Marcelo, we ended up with this number that matches the exact day, time, to the minute that we're here together tonight. So you're lucky to be here. I'm glad you're here with us. This isn't a magic show, but we're going to talk about some fun and some magic. So one of my favorite books, since this is kind of an emergency preparedness and kind of this, first aid, and we're going to keep things in emergency preparedness and longevity. One of my favorite books on kind of survival, in an apocalyptic situation, is this book called Patriots. And in the book Patriots, the salt becomes a really big part of this book in this survival time period. One of my favorite TV shows, it wasn't around very long, but one of my favorite TV shows is a show called Jericho. And if you haven't watched Jericho, this is the trailer for Jericho, one of the funnest TV shows on survival. So that show Jericho takes place in Jericho, Kansas. And one of the most unique parts of Jericho, Kansas is there's a salt mine right there in town. So through this series of this post-apocalyptic time period where an EMP wipes out airplanes and brings the whole country to its knees, the salt makes a big part in this story. So we'll talk a little bit about some of that later on, but we're going to start with just a little bit of history on salt. So when it comes to salt, every civilization started around access to the salt deposits. The reason for that, it was essential for food preservation, for human health, essential for animal health. It was a source of religious ceremonies. In fact, if you read any religious text, it talks about salt, and has salt lost its savor, and where will the earth be salted? And so salt has always been an immense, important part of society. In fact, whoever controls the salt deposits wins the war. In fact, until just probably about 10 years ago, you could not sell salt into mainland China because the emperor controls access to salt. Because if there is no refrigeration and there's a land war, when death is on the line, you actually have to have salt to preserve your food. Because if you don't have a refrigerator, you can't preserve food outside of season. So the Chinese Empire, the Roman Empire, the British, the English, even and including the Civil War, salt became a big part of that, because in the Revolutionary War, the colonies took out the British's access to salt, and in the Civil War, the North took out the South Salt Works in the Carolinas. And because they took out that access to salt, then the military starts to suffer. If you can't preserve your food and you're sweating and you can't replace that lost salt, then everything starts to go downhill fast. And so whoever controls the salt deposits wins the war. Am I getting that echo, or maybe I should? If it's much of an echo, I can move or not move. So some of the misconceptions around salt. People have heard that salt is salt, that all salts are created equal. People have heard that sea salt is better. In fact, years ago, if we would have said who has heard that sea salt's better, almost everybody would have raised their hands back in the 70s, 80s, 90s. Today, you can have sea salt that's sea grade, that's actually worse than the table salt that you might be thinking is better than sea salt. And I'll show you some examples of that a little bit later. Another interesting thing about salt is you'll hear kosher. There's actually two meanings of the word kosher, and we'll talk a little bit about that later, but if you're ever watching TV or you see a recipe and the chef calls for kosher salt, unless you're watching Jewish cooking TV, the chef is meaning a particular size of crystal. Now in Judaism, according to the Torah, the first 5 books of the Old Testament, blood is not kosher, or it's not clean. And so if you're Jewish and you want to have a nice piece of steak, you can't do that unless you get the blood out of the steak. The way you get blood out of meat is salt. And a larger salt crystal will suck the blood out of the meat faster than a finer salt crystal without making the meat overly salty. And so if you've ever been to a Japanese restaurant and you've seen the little salt crystals on the edamame beans, or maybe you've had a pretzel and there's those larger salt crystal on a pretzel, or maybe not, but if you've ever been and had a margarita rimmer, that rim that they put on margarita glasses of salt or sugar is a larger sized crystal. And they do that because of the way it dissolves on the tongue. And so koshering salt is a size of salt crystal. And in Judaism, there is a rabbi that does not offer a blessing, but a rabbi will come to a facility and inspect the facility like a health inspector. And so if you bought a shaker or a pouch of real salt and you look on the back, you'll see this little symbol with an OU. That stands for the Orthodox Union, which is a certifying body. So with this particular salt up here in Heber where we package it, once a year, a rabbi will come to the facility, doesn't do anything other than walks through and just make sure that everybody's washing their hands and there's no unclean things according to the Torah. And so that's what kosher means. So you can have kosher-sized salt that is not kosher certified, or you can have kosher certified salt that is not kosher sized, or you can have kosher sized salt that is also kosher certified. So don't let that get too crazy when you're looking, or if you read a recipe, unless that recipe is something like a prime rib or a baked potato or edamame, the size of the salt doesn't make any difference, because once you throw it in your kimchi, your sauerkraut, or you put it in your soup, it's going to melt anyway or dissolve. And so the size doesn't matter in the size of the crystal. Similar to confection or sugar. If you put a Jolly Rancher in your mouth or a sugar cube, your mouth is going to touch all of the outside of the cube, but not the inside. If you take that Jolly Rancher and you pulverize it into powder and make confection or sugar, and you put that whole amount in your mouth, it's going to be disgustingly sweet. And salt's the same way. So if you take a salt crystal and you pulverize it into powder, you amplify the flavor. And so we do have a powder salt that's great for popcorn and chips and things like that, because the flavor just hits stronger, versus if you were making pretzels, if you put powder salt on a pretzel, it's going to taste way too salty. But a kosher sized crystal on a pretzel is just the perfect size. So that's a little bit about kosher versus kosher. A little bit later, we're going to talk about Florida salt, rock salt, crystal salt, pink salt, black salt. We've got some examples up here on this board that I'll show you later. And I'm a big fan of all salt. Obviously, I'm a little biased, but I'm going to talk about other great salts out there. And so whatever great salt you find, and hopefully you get it from Marcelo, but there's a lot of good salts besides just ours, although yes, I am biased. Now, salt is one of the most misunderstood minerals on Earth, because for thousands of years it sustained life. It was a source of trade. It was written about in every religious text. And yet, you go back 10 years ago or 20 years ago, and everybody's saying, oh my gosh, salt's bad. You got to eat less salt. It's going to kill all of us. And yet that doesn't make sense, because we just learned that salt is the essence of life. So how did this become such a misunderstood mineral? Well, our bodies are saline solution in motion. And without salt, everything dies. So I've got a little illustration here. Now, we remember from grade school or somewhere along the line that we learned that our bodies are about 72% water. Kind of a fun fact, if you look at the Earth is about 72% water, and so are our bodies, it's kind of fun. But if I'm 150 pounds, that means I've got about 108 pounds of water and 42 pounds of mineral. Outside of a spiritual discussion, that's really all that I am, is water and salt and an electric current. Because my hand moves because an electrical impulse goes from my mind to my fingers. My thoughts are an electric current. everything that I'm doing is because I conduct electricity, which is why if I were to fall over and have a heart attack right here on the ground and go into cardiac arrest or into fibrillation, the first thing the EMTs are going to do is they're going to come in. They're probably going to start an IV to help balance those fluids. But the first thing they're going to do, if I'm in, fibrillation, is they're going to pull out a defibrillator to try to reestablish my electric current because my heart's fluttering and not beating like it should because that electric current or that electric impulse is off. So outside of a spiritual discussion, because I am only water, salt, and electricity, that is why salt, water, and electricity and air are so important. So here in this little dish, I've got distilled water. Now, distilled water is a very poor conductor of electricity. And if I plug this light bulb in, if distilled water were conductive, then the electricity would shoot from this wire over to this wire and my light bulb would turn on. What you're going to find here is if I didn't break my light bulb on the way down today in the traffic, that nothing happens, which is what nothing should happen because that water is a poor conductor of electricity. Now, when you think about our tears, are salt, our sweat is salt, our urine, trust me, is salt. And so even if we're drinking all of the distilled water in the world, we are still urinating and perspiring and crying salt water. And so when we lose all that salt, we start to impact our ability to conduct electricity. So as we add salt back, those electrolytes begin to build, and as that salt becomes conductive, as that water becomes conductive, then the water can maintain an electric current. And our bodies are the same way. This is why even if you have high blood pressure, even if you have water retention, even if you have whatever you might think is a problem with salt, whatever those things are, as soon as you go to the hospital, the first thing they're going to do is they're going to give you an IV of saline solution. They're not going to give you an IV of tap water. They're not going to give you an IV of Coke or Diet Coke even, or whatever our favorite drink is, which hopefully is water. They're not going to give you that in an IV. What they're going to do is they're going to give you saline solution, which is 0.9. There's two standard IVs in the hospital. The main one is 0.9% saline. The reason when you go swimming in the ocean and it stings your eyes, our oceans today are about 3% salt. And our bodies are essentially 1. And so the oceans are 3 times saltier than we are, which is why if you get an IV or you get a rinse of saline solution in your eyes, there's no sensation. But if you rinse your nasal cavity with distilled water, it burns. If you ever pour distilled water in your eye, it stings because that distilled water is pulling the salt out of your eyes, and your eyes should have salt. And so that's why that 0.9% is pretty critical. The other thing you might see when you go to the hospital is a bag of lactated ringers, which looks a lot like oh, okay. So I'll just start it again, see if that. There we go. So this is a bag of lactated ringers. So lactated ringers is the other traditional bag you'll see at the hospital if you go in for a baby or same-day surgery. And what you'll notice is each 100 milliliters contains sodium chloride, sodium lactate, potassium chloride, calcium chloride. So it's not pure sodium chloride. And that's because our bodies require these other electrolytes to offset sodium. One of the key parts in the cell is something called the sodium-potassium pump. And it operates and pulls in sodium into the cell and releases potassium and back and forth. So what that means is you need all of the electrolytes and not any isolation of any of those key electrolytes. So you really can't overdose on salt if it's in the right form. You'd really have to go out of your way. And you look at animals, animals don't overdose on salt. If you have a horse, horses are really smart. They walk over and they eat the salt that they need, and they walk over and they drink water, and then they walk over and they'll eat some certain soil here. They might pick at a tree there, and they might even eat a fence post if they're kind of low on some of those minerals, because the horses are pretty smart. And just like salt is a complex, salt is not pure sodium and chloride with other chemicals added. Salt in nature is a complex chloride. Similar to ascorbic acid is part of vitamin C. But if you look at a vitamin C in an orange, it's a complex. It's not pure ascorbic acid. And you can go buy ascorbic acid tablets and you can overdose on ascorbic acid tablets and give you diarrhea and a couple other things. You'd have a tougher time overdosing on oranges. Yes, you could if you really tried, but you'd have to try to overdose on oranges where you don't really even have to try to overdose on ascorbic acid. Beta carotene is the same way. Beta carotene is super essential, but high doses of beta carotene can cause problems. In fact, birth defects are noted because some people hear, oh, I need to get a lot of beta carotene because I'm pregnant, and so they'll go over the top and get too much beta carotene, and that causes a problem. But you can't overdose. You'd have a tougher time overdosing on carrots, even though carrots are high in beta carotene. And you could, in theory, if you really tried, to overdose on natural salt, but you'd have to go out of your way to do that because natural salt, just like other things in our bodies, you can overdose on water if you really tried, and you can overdose on salt if you really try, but in nature it doesn't happen that way until we start monkeying with it. And this is why. So what does salt do for the body? I'm not going to go through all of this big long list, but some of the main things is stabilizes heartbeat, which is why it's used intravenously. It also helps conduct electricity, which is essential in the hospitals for maintaining that electric current. It's vital to cell production and cell cleansing. Salt itself is one of the best cleansers in the body. When you drink some water and you have some salt before you go to bed, the first thing you do when you wake up, you go to the bathroom and you flush a lot of those because at night our bodies are constantly detoxing from all of the stress and all of the bad food and maybe some of the bad air that we're breathing. On our side, our bodies, thankfully, are really good at detoxing, and salt is a big part of that. Water, good clean water and good clean salt is how the body does that. Interestingly enough, one of the other top things with salt, it's vital for food digestion. If you think of our stomachs use hydrochloric acid. That's how we digest our food. We don't eat hydrochloric acid, thank goodness, but our bodies, interestingly or divinely, are able to create hydrochloric acid, which is one of the highest, most acidic acids out there. And we do that from hydrochloric acid is HCl. Hydrogen comes from the water, and the Cl is the chloride. So as soon as you start cutting all of the salt, which is where we get most of our chlorides from our diet, our system starts to struggle. And so one of the first things people notice on a low salt diet is their digestion really starts to go, because salt is such an important part, not only for the electric current in the stomach, and also for how our bodies absorb particles, because our bodies are based in salt. And it's actually, we've known this for years. Anybody that's served in the military knows that, military are always given salt tablets, because if you're running and sweating, you're losing all that salt. And if you don't replace that, unfortunately, even today in our civilized society where we know a lot about salt and the importance of electrolytes, we'll still see young men that are in Texas or they're in California or they're even back east, and they're running, they're sweating, they've got their rucksacks on, they're drinking tons of water, and yet one of them will still pass out and sometimes even die from hyponatremia. Hyponatremia is low salt, hypothermia is low temp, hyponatremia is low salt. And you'll see that on the news. Sometimes it's high school football players, sometimes it's the military. In fact, there's a product that all of you are probably familiar with called Gatorade. It was a product created to aid the Florida Gators because they were running in the hot Florida sun. They're cramping up, feeling nauseous, just terrible performance. And somebody said, hey, we need to create a product to aid the Florida Gators to reintroduce salt and electrolytes. And so they started with a great idea, and then they added tons of sugar and then tons of artificial colors and flavors. And now we have this product that doesn't look anything like the original product that was supposed to aid the Florida Gators. And I'll give you a recipe a little bit later so you can make your own at pennies on the dollar for what you could buy at the store. It's also a strong antihistamine. In fact, if you go to the Romans, the Persians, the Greeks, all of them would carry salt into battle with them because a quarter teaspoon of salt under the tongue cuts phlegm really quickly. It's not a fast-acting inhaler like an albuterol, but it does cut phlegm, and it's a great antihistamine. And so that first little tickle in your throat, you can actually put salt under your tongue, and that's how the Persians, the Romans, the Greeks, all of those ancient societies would have dealt with histamines. So all kinds of things. I mean, the list goes on and on. Helps regulate sleep is a big one. My dad talks a lot about people saying that, you know, a quarter teaspoon of salt under their tongue before bed saved their marriage. And it's just because a lot of people, it ends up with some restless leg type situations and Charlie horses and cramps. It typically, one of the main reasons for that is electrolyte imbalances. And so as you can put a quarter teaspoon of salt under your tongue in a big glass of water, that can really help reset the body for sleep, because all of us are on different levels of how much salt we should have and how much salt we are getting. So now you might say, well, that sounds great, Daryl, but actually give me some medical studies. I'm glad you asked. This is from Dr. Robert Thompson. He's an MD. This is a book called The Calcium Lie. And he says the lack of unrefined salt is synonymous with birth defects, miscarriage, organ failure, premature aging, and death at a young age. And the best source of those minerals is salt. Any farmers know that if you don't have access to salt for your cows, for your horses, for your sheep, the calf rates and the deaths of babies, baby farm animals, just skyrockets. Hoof rot skyrockets, and all of these problems in animal husbandry show up when we're not giving our animals access to salt. Any farmer knows that, and yet when we talk about ourselves, we limit ourselves, but we don't limit our own animals. Now in nature, our animals would have access to the whole Salt Lake Valley, right? So they could go over and eat salt from the Great Salt Lake shores, from the coastal Lake Bonneville. They could go, you know, paw the ground and find some ancient salt deposits. If they're in a cage or even in a paddock, even if it's a nice big open paddock, you might not have salt there naturally enough to sustain life. So early civilizations followed the animals. Where the animals went, they found the salt, and that's how early man set up around access to the salt deposits. So if you look at any early civilizations, they actually all started around access to the salt deposits. In fact, some of the sayings that I usually have to preface this by saying, now some of your grandparents and parents might have heard these sayings. I think it's safe to say that you probably have heard these sayings. But one of those is a man worth his salt, right? That's a saying. Well, that is a saying because in the times of Rome, you were paid a salary, which is also salt-based, salary, saline, salt. You were paid a wage or a salary in salt. And if you were lazy and you weren't worth the salt that you were getting paid, that man wasn't worth his salt that he was getting paid. And so that's where that saying comes from. And because of that, salt traded ounce for gold for quite a bit of antiquity. It doesn't do that anymore, or you would have all been rushing the table. And because of more abundance of salt and because of trade, but that does show that the spice trade and early civilizations really valued salt as such an important part of life. There's a great book, Salt Your Way to Health, Dr. David Brownstein, and he researched 3,000 patients, and they found that there was a 430% increase in myocardial infarction, which is heart attack, in those that were consuming the lowest amounts of salt, not the highest amounts of salt. So it wasn't the salt that was the problem that they found. It seems clear to me that a low-salt diet is not only ineffective at controlling blood pressure, it's actually deleterious to the body. Our bodies were meant to function on adequate amounts of salt, as we kind of illustrated a little bit earlier. So how did salt become the health destroyer? Well, great question. So if we went back before we had a refrigerator, which was around 1876, all of us would have eaten more salt. And that's because our kimchis, our sauerkrauts, all of our preserved meats outside of season would have used salt in that process. Now today, we're lucky we have a refrigerator, so we can store stuff maybe longer than we should, and we have all of these processed foods that have a longer shelf life than we do that we probably shouldn't eat. Now, because salt absorbs moisture very well, and salt is a natural antiseptic, it's antibacterial, it's antiviral, salt does all of those things. Because of that, salt becomes a very popular preservative. And so we as collective society, we can take foods that are super nutrient poor, that we probably shouldn't eat anyway, and we can add copious amounts of processed salt to it to keep that food around a lot longer than it should. And then if we eat that, we're getting poor food, poor nutrition, and copious amounts of processed salt. Not the natural salt, we're going to define those two in a second. But that's really what happened to society, because if we went back 100, 200, 300 years ago, we would have eaten more salt and we wouldn't have had the high blood pressure, the water retention, and all of the problems that we've come to associate with salt. Just like your horses don't have high blood pressure, our cows don't get water retention because of salt, and yet somehow that ends up on us. And so we'll talk a little bit about how that happened. Couple of things. So again, I give this to a lot of other maybe like University of Medicine type things, but this is from the American Journal of Medicine. And so you can see when sodium was expressed, so right at this bottom paragraph right there, adjusting for calories and all previously mentioned cardiovascular disease risk factors, sodium intake of less than 2,300 milligrams, that's the daily recommended allowance. So sodium intake of less than 2,300 milligrams was associated with a 37% greater risk of cardiovascular disease mortality and a 28% increase of all-cause mortality. So the lowest salt groups eating less than the daily recommended allowance, 38% increase in cardiovascular disease death and a 28% increase in all death universally because salt is so essential. Reduced sodium diets also impact the way we absorb sugars. And so once you cut down on salt, your insulin resistance spikes and your ability to process sugars spike. And so we're thinking we're doing best back then by cutting our salt. And what we found was that it increased our blood sugar, it increased our insulin resistance, and we didn't sleep well, we didn't digest our food well. And that's how salt is now made that same transition that fat did. If you remember years ago, everybody thought that all fat was bad. We went through this phase that, oh my gosh, we can't eat anything that's fat because all fat's bad. And then we realized, oops, we were wrong. There's actually good fats that we need. Our brains are mostly fats, and we don't have those. Our brains don't function very well. Our eyes need good fats. Our whole bodies need good fats. That doesn't mean we need all of the bad fats. And salt is that same way. Just like you absolutely need good fat in your diet, you absolutely need good salt. And just like how high diets of really bad fats, big problem, and high diets of really bad salt is equally a big problem. So that was the American Journal of Medicine. This is the American Journal of Clinical Nutrition. They say the same thing. I'm going to jump down. They reported that individuals consuming high amounts of sodium and chloride could fall into the highest or the lowest blood pressure groups, depending on if they were deficient in adequate amounts of calcium, and then it goes on to add potassium and magnesium to that list. And that just confirmed the American Journal of Medicine saying that individuals with those low salt diets are the ones that are having the worst health outcomes. So we'll talk a little bit more about that in a second, but one question we often get asked is, well, what about iodine? Now, no discussion on salt would not be complete without a discussion on iodine. The reason for that is not what you might think. If you've ever noticed a shaker of salt or a pouch of salt that says this salt does not supply iodide, a necessary nutrient, the reason that's there isn't because salt was always supposed to contain iodine. The reason for that is actually World War I. If we go back to World War I, when the draft was instituted, in the Midwest, there was a high problem with goiter. Goiter is an iodine deficiency it's a result of an iodine deficiency. And so the military got together with the government and said, we have got to stop this goiter problem or we can't draft men out of the Midwest. Now the Midwest is interesting because if you go back into that 1917 time frame, the Midwest is now nowhere near the coast. They're not eating foods rich in iodine, naturally, because a lot of those iodine foods come out of the ocean. And at that time, everybody's thinking white flour, white sugar, white salt, white's better. And when it comes to processed foods, turns out they weren't quite right on that. And so the government sat down and said, hey, what are we going to do to force people to eat more iodine? How can we do that? And they looked at trying to add iodine to water. Now, iodine is purple and it has a really sharp taste. And so you can't really add it to the water system or people quit drinking water. They actually tried to add it to flour because everybody was eating out of processed flour bags. And they tried to add it as a dough enhancer to hide iodine in flour. It doesn't work. And so they ended up with salt. And so they said, okay, we can add this processed iodine to processed salt and we can force consumption on the population. And it's so important that if, as a salt manufacturer, if you do not put a warning on your jar that says this salt does not supply iodine, a necessary nutrient, unless you add iodine to it, you have to put that on there. Which is interesting because natural salts have about 10% of the daily recommended allowance of iodine. Iodized salt, processed iodized salt, has about 50%. But unless we add additional iodine to the already nature-created iodized salt, we have to put a warning that says it doesn't contain it, even though it actually contains it, because we don't add that much more. Now, what's interesting is the iodine that's added is less than 10% bioavailable. And so they add it, but you don't get much out of it. Now, the silver lining is if we had a nuclear facility here, our thyroids love halogens. So halogens, we'll talk a little bit about that. Well, I'll get right to that. So the reason iodine is so important is if you look at tumors, benign tumors have 53% of the iodine levels that those skin cells should have. The malignant tumors have 3% of the iodine that those tumors should have. So when it comes to women's health, for years, women's doctors have said iodine, iodine, iodine because of the tumors in the breast tissue and in the reproductive system. Turns out that it's just as important for men because we actually have a reproductive system too, and we have other parts of our bodies, and iodine is important for men as well. So iodine, just like salt, is incredible for all kinds of parts in the body. It's a natural antibacterial, which is why they'll use it for cuts and things like that, but iodine does so many things in our bodies. Now, this I mentioned before, so if you add iodine, so this chart on the left, this is micrograms. So they were saying, okay, if we're going to add iodine if we're going to add 750 micrograms of iodine, we would expect the blood serum levels to be right about 17. That's because you don't absorb all of it, but we would expect that. Now, when you add iodine to bread, you actually get more iodine out of the bread than the iodine itself has because it unlocks some other iodine and maybe in the wheat and the gluten and other things. When you add 750 micrograms of iodine to salt, you pick up less than 10% of that, which is again why salt is a poor conductor or a poor transport for iodine. So the halogen group, this is why this is important. So our thyroids, they love halogens. So if there was a nuclear meltdown here, they would give all of us iodine tablets. Some of you from the Cold War era remember that. And they would say, hey, everybody should have iodine tablets with them because if there's nuclear fallout, you take iodine tablets. Now, iodine is fun because iodine is essential for our health unless it's iodine 23. Iodine 23 will kill you. That's a radioactive isotope of iodine. But your thyroid isn't smart enough to know what iodine is good and what iodine is bad. And so iodine tablets are a thing because if I start taking a bunch of iodine tablets and I saturate the particles uptake on my thyroid, I can't absorb additional iodine. So iodine 23 can't impact my thyroid if it's already saturated with good iodine. That's why you have iodine tablets. Now, the reason that does that is atomic mass. So I won't get into the science of it, but I think it's kind of cool, so I'm going to lightly touch on it. If you look at the halogens and the periodic table of elements as a whole are listed with the smallest particles on top and the biggest ones on bottom. So if you go by atomic mass, you see fluorine, chlorine, bromine, iodine in order of smallest to biggest. So, and the biggest one is iodine. So iodine is this big, fluorine is this big, chlorine is this big, bromine is this big, and iodine is this big. So if I had a big barrel of steel balls, and some of those were little teeny, some of those were medium sized, some of those are really big, and I take a big magnet and I put it in there and I swing it as fast as I can. When I pull that out, that magnet's going to be covered in all the little ones because the little ones are going to fight their way in and eventually push the big ones out. That happens with our thyroids too. And so halogen contamination is one of the reasons people struggle with iodine consumption because bromine, which is new car smell, it's also, if you ever buy enriched flour, next time you're at the store, you probably don't because you're all being very healthy and buying the good flour or you're grinding your own wheat. But if you go and buy enriched flour and you look close, it's enriched, almost always it's enriched with bromide. And bromide is a dough enhancer. And if you go and buy a donut at the store, or you go buy a loaf of Wonder Bread, and it says enriched flour, it's enriched with bromide because it's a dough enhancer. If you buy enriched flour, which I'd recommend you don't, it's enriched with bromide. Most of it is. And that can block iodine reception. So iodine is super essential. Salt is a poor way to get it. And if you get things like chlorine, bromine, and fluoride, all of those things will compete for iodine because iodine is the biggest. So the more you can reduce some of those halogen contaminations and you can search out good sources of iodine, the better you're going to be long term. But salt is a poor conductor. Now, if you only transporter, if your only access to iodine in the world was iodized salt, ignore everything I said. Because a little bit of iodine, even in a weird form, is better than no iodine at all. So in my food storage, I don't store iodized salt. I store iodine itself, iodine drops that I can use as a supplement. I can use it for cuts. I can use it for little surgeries even, because iodine is essential, but I would rather have it as pure iodine and not iodized salt. So store your salt, store your iodine, and use both of them. That's my iodine horse, I suppose, soapbox. Now, good foods in iodine. Most people, depending on what your diets are, you can go out of your way to add iodine to your diet. Sea veggies, kelp is really good. Dulse, D-U-L-C-E, I think, is the highest source of iodine that we know of in a plant form. It's purple seaweed. And it's really good. You can buy seaweed snacks. You can buy seaweed itself. Fish, because it comes from the ocean, and iodine comes from the ocean, and salt comes from the ocean. So all of those things have iodine, but sea veggies, meats, cranberries, navy beans, potato skins, all good ways to get iodine. And then a couple of my favorite is Lugol's solution. That's actually what I have in my food storage. Iodine virtually lives forever. You could probably go to some old World War I rations, and the iodine is still going to be good. So you don't have to worry about it going bad. Just store it, buy it in a few bottles, and just store it. And that's Lugol's. Now, when it comes to salt, if all you'd ever seen in your whole life was white salt, or white flour, if all you'd ever seen was white flour, the first time you went and saw wheat flour, or you ground your own flour, you might be like, oh my gosh, look how dirty that flour is. There's all this stuff in the flour. It's supposed to look white. And salt's kind of the same way. If all you've ever seen is these little beady salt crystals, like Marcelo was back in 2002, and then you see this salt that looks like snowflakes and every crystal looks different, there's some color in it, you're going to say, oh my gosh, somebody ruined the salt. But in fact, that's not the case. So, now there's two things that can go wrong with salt. If we go back in antiquity and we went and found salt in the tombs of Egypt, or we went and saw salt anywhere back then, salt was how nature created it. Very different from a lot of the salts on the shelf today. And there's two things that can go wrong, and we're going to talk about those. The first is salt is hygroscopic. Hygroscopic means, is a funny chemistry word, that means sucks water out of the air. Hygroscopic. So we don't see it a lot in Utah because we're such a dry state. But if I had this crystal in Hawaii, or I had it in Florida, or even in Utah on a really cold, rainy day when the humidity's high, and I put it on a plate, the plate will actually end up with water on it because it actually is sucking water out of the air. And if I have you hold this crystal in your hand for just a few minutes, your hands will get really sweaty. And it's not that you're sweating, it's actually the salt crystal is pulling the water out of my hands. Just like when you put a salt crystal on top of a tomato, you'll see a little pool of water form, or salt on top of watermelon, which is divine. You'll see the water start to form around those salt crystals. Or you're doing a prime rib and you put the salt on top. That's because it's hygroscopic. Now, that's good because salt's job in the body is to help regulate our intracellular and our extracellular fluids. That's salt's job. But if you take the salt and you put it in a shaker, and now on a really humid day, the salt shaker is sucking the water out of the air, and now the salt doesn't pour out of the shaker because it's kind of sticky. So if we were a bunch of chemists and we were a salt company, we might go and say, hey, chemists, what chemical can we coat that crystal with to completely stop its ability to interact with moisture? You know, what can we coat that crystal with to stop it doing what its job is to do? And this is the list that we would come up with. In fact, this is the list. So these are all approved additives for salt to stop salt's ability to interact with moisture. Again, our body's salt's job in the body is to regulate moisture, and we're going to coat the crystal and stop it. Now let's look at that list. Some things aren't too bad. Sodium bicarbonate, that's just baking soda. So one of the things you can add to salt is baking soda, and that helps stop the salt interacting. They should have stopped there, because that's actually, of all of the ones, baking soda is actually alkaline, has some good uses for it. But then we go on. Sodium iodide, we'll talk about that in a second. We already did a little bit. Silicon dioxide, this is where it takes a sharp turn. This next one is yellow precipitative soda. If you pulled your phone out and typed yellow precipitative soda, it might give you the name anti-caking agent E535, because E535 is an approved name for yellow precipitative soda. And you think, well, that's not helpful. What's anti-caking agent E535? Sodium ferrocyanide. Sodium ferrocyanide is yellow precipitative soda, and it's also known as anti-caking agent E535. Now, you don't need to be a chemist to know that sodium ferrocyanide is sodium, ferro is iron, and cyanide is not good. And yet, this is a common salt additive that I'll show you some products here in a second. And this is why Marcelo said he got sick when he eats other salt. And everybody's more sensitive or less sensitive. But if you're eating a chemical that's called sodium ferrocyanide that's stopping this crystal's ability to do what God intended this crystal to do, and every morning you're sprinkling a little bit of cyanide on your eggs at breakfast, no wonder you're not feeling so good the next day when that cyanide's working through our systems. Now, it's approved because one little dose isn't going to be a problem. But that doesn't mean that you should put it on your eggs every day for the next 30, 40, 50, 60, 70 years. The next one down, sodium silicoaluminate. If you've ever looked at your antiperspirant, they link about, and they link antiperspirants to aluminum toxicity, and there's competing research on that. But if you were to take 2 licks of your antiperspirant every morning before breakfast, or you take your antiperspirant and wipe it across your steak, you know, who would in their right mind do that? And yet it is an approved additive for salt. Then we go down to the next one. Magnesium carbonate, that's not too bad. Some of these aren't too bad. Tricalcium phosphate, dextrose, which is sugar, is an additive. Potassium glutamate, we keep coming down. And then we see propylene glycol 400. Any mechanics in the room will recognize propylene glycol right away as antifreeze. Now, this is not antifreeze, but it's 1 carbon away from it, which is another chemical that you probably don't want to be eating on a daily basis. So, this is the MSDS sheet, the material safety data sheet for some of those chemicals I just showed you. So sodium bicarbonate, slightly hazardous in case of an ingestion or inhalation, not really too bad. But let's jump down to yellow precipitative soda. Potential acute health effects, extremely hazardous in case of ingestion, hazardous in case of skin contact, eye contact, or inhalation. Second from the bottom, that's right after potential chronic health effects. Extremely hazardous in case of ingestion, down at the bottom. This substance is toxic to the blood, the lungs, the mucous membranes. Repeated prolonged exposure to this substance can produce target organ damage. And yet this is in some salts I'm going to show you in a second. Sodium silicoaluminate, kind of the bottom of that one. Repeated exposure to a highly toxic material can produce a general deterioration of health by accumulation in one or many organs. This is sodium silicoaluminate that's added to a lot of the salts on the market today. Magnesium, that's actually not too bad unless you get super high doses of it. Actually, milk and magnesium is actually good for us in the right ratios. Calcium silicate, potassium iodide. Now this is interesting because this is the one that's added for iodine and for the thyroid, but you look at the bottom, this substance may be toxic to the thyroid because it's not in the real form. That's like, you would not see that on dulse or on kelp or on seaweed or on pinto beans, but because when you refine it and take high amounts of it, that can be a problem. So tricalcium phosphate, that's not too bad. And then dextrose, we used to say just a spoonful of sugar helps the bad salt go down in the most delightful way, kind of like Mary Poppins. But that's not the case. Sugar is not added to salt to make it sweet. It's actually added as a stabilizer. Some of those chemicals that I showed you before will turn yellow or blue over time. And if you put dextrose with your salt that has those chemicals, it'll slow down that expiration date on the salt. So if you ever see sugar as an ingredient on your salt, maybe keep that for barter, or maybe use it for Play-Doh for the kids, or use it for ice melt so you don't slip on your porch. But if you see sugar, yellow prussiate of soda, sodium ferrocyanide, if you went home tonight and you just happen to see that, I would just set that one aside and use that for something else and not for your eggs. So, interestingly enough, we went through this phase in the US where we thought that all salt was bad, and so if salt is bad, maybe I should get a salt substitute. Now what's interesting is if you look at any label on a salt substitute, there's a warning, and every single salt substitute will have a warning that says for normal healthy people, persons having diabetes, heart or kidney disease, or persons receiving medical treatment should consult a physician before using this product. You would never see that on a good clean salt. You only see it on salt substitutes, and that's because the chemicals that are added to a salt substitute are harder on the heart at even small levels than just salt itself is, even a processed salt. Largely because they usually cut it with potassium chloride. And potassium chloride is the final injection in a series of lethal injections. So they give you an injection to put you out, then they give you an injection to stop the pain, and then they give you an injection of potassium chloride, and that'll stop your heart. And that's why you'll see that on this warning. But because people think sodium chloride's bad, they'll cut it with potassium chloride, which actually is worse unless you're under the care of a physician. Here's another example, light salt, potassium chloride, for normal healthy people. If you're a normal healthy person, why would you be using this salt substitute for one? But then if that's really good for you, why would they put a warning on it that's required by law because of how hard those salt substitutes can be for your heart? This is another one. If you're receiving treatment for diabetes, kidney, or heart disorder, consult your general practitioner before use. That's the overseas version of those same salt substitutes. Now we get into just some other salts. Now I share these not to throw any other company under the bus, but just so you can see what I've been telling you for the last 20 minutes about these other type of salts. I'm not just making this, I'm not making it up. So this has two ingredients, salt and calcium phosphate. Now I want to stop here because salt, when you see salt on a label, isn't just salt. I said before that there are two problems with processed salts today. I just explained the one in super heavy detail, and that's that salt is coated with a chemical to stop its ability to interact with moisture. The second problem is salt is often demineralized. And if you went to the Great Salt Lake and you filled up a cup of water, that is not pure sodium and chloride in water. That's got a lot of magnesium chloride in it. Actually, the most profitable mineral out of the Great Salt Lake is magnesium. And so they'll use a series of evaporation ponds, or if you've ever flown over San Francisco Bay and you see those evaporation ponds, through a series of evaporation ponds, they can manipulate those chlorides. So at the Great Salt Lake, they'll move it into a pond and they'll leach off the magnesium chloride. They can sell it as a chemical as mag chloride. They can also, through electrolysis, turn that mag chloride into metal magnesium. That's very expensive. And so they can sell that mag off. Then they move it to the next pond and they can pull off the potassium chloride. They can use it for all kinds of things. Then they move to the next pond, they can leach off the calcium chloride. And then they can move it to the next pond and they can sell that as the leftovers. Similar, if we were, let's say we were a group of citrus growers in Florida, and we came up with this really cool technology that we could take an orange and we could suck out all of the vitamin C from the orange, and then we could sell the vitamin C as a supplement, and then we could sell the orange as an orange. I mean, we'd be high-fiving all the way to the bank. And same thing with your dairy farmers. You know, everybody knows that's in dairy farming that the value of the milk is actually not the milk, it's the milk fat. So as a dairy farmer, if we can take the milk and we can take all of the cream off the top, And we can take that cream and make, sell it for butter, sell it for ice cream, sell it for whipping cream, and then we can sell the skimmed milk over here. Then we've just, as a farmer, we're geniuses. But as a consumer, if I'm going to buy the milk, there's actually stories, right, about milk strippings gone wrong. And that's because the value isn't in the milk. The value's in the cream. That's where the nutrition is. And salt's the same way. And so when you see salt here on a label, that salt, you got to keep in mind, is demineralized salt to start with. So we're going to demineralize it, and then we're going to add the chemicals to it, and that's what we see in these shakers. So iodized salt, sodium silicoaluminate, dextrose, potassium iodide, sodium bicarbonate. Sodium silicoaluminate, that's the one they link to the chemical. It's an antiperspirant. Going to jump to this one. Now this one kind of gets made fun of a lot, but yet actually it's probably the best one we've seen so far because it doesn't have some of those other additives. Calcium silicate, that's not that bad. Dextrose, I don't like that. Potassium iodide, I'd rather get my iodine in a way that my body can use it better. But it doesn't have sodium ferrocyanide, and it doesn't have sodium silicoaluminate. So far, I might actually use this one. And then we get to this one. Now it's got salt, which is again demineralized salt, silicon dioxide, tricalcium phosphate, dextrose, potassium carbonate, potassium iodide, and the list goes on and on. So it's just not what you think it is when you go and you think, oh, this is good salt. Now, this is where it's interesting because a lot of you thought that sea salt is better. And now I have a sea salt on the screen, but the sea salt is the one that has the yellow prussiate of soda, which is sodium ferrocyanide. So even though this is sea salt, this is not the one that I would take. I'd actually take the processed table salt before I took this one just because of the additives. Now both of these are demineralized to start with, and then this additive is worse than the other one. So don't think of the term sea salt anymore because it doesn't mean what it used to mean. Because all salt comes from a seabed at some point. It comes from a current ocean, like the San Francisco Bay or the Gulf of Mexico. It can come from a dead sea, like the Dead Sea in Israel, the Dead Sea here in Utah called the Great Salt Lake. Or it could come from an underground or an ancient seabed like that occurs in Redmond, like that occurs in Pakistan for the Himalayan pink, or in Bolivia. So those are the three sources of salt. They're all a seabed. It's just the age of that sea. Here's another one. Now this is a sea salt. I'd actually use this sea salt before I use the other one because this one doesn't have yellow prussiate of soda in it. This just has calcium silicate, dextrose, potassium iodide, and sodium bicarbonate. But it's still not what I want when I'm looking at good, natural, clean salt. Now this one's kind of funny because you might, of all the ones I have talked about, you might pick this one up. If I sent you to a store and said, pick the best sea salt you can find, you might come up with this one because it looks great, it looks natural. And yet we have magnesia, which is magnesium carbonate. That's not too bad, actually. If you're constipated, that's kind of nice sometimes. And then it has anti-caking agent E535. Pull out your phone, like, what the crap is anti-caking agent E535? Turns out it's sodium ferrocyanide. And so why would ever I use that salt? Now this one here, they don't have to say refined. Now, fortunately, this has no additives in it. It's a great start. This refined, though, is giving you a little bit of an indication that they've pulled off some of those other elements. And then we get to this one, which there's no additives, which is great. If you flip the label over, though, I think it's kind of fun because even the label says, right here, seawater is transferred through a series of evaporation ponds which successfully eliminates other elements. So even on the label, they're telling you what they're doing, but we still are going to buy it because it looks better than the other ones. And in fact, it probably is because there's no additives, but they're also taking those other elements away. So how much is too much salt? Well, a healthy kidney can process 4 ounces of salt a day. This was 2. So a healthy kidney can actually go through 4 ounces of salt per day. And that's why you really can't overdose on salt. In fact, if you're in a hospital and you get 2 bags of saline solution, you already have more than the daily recommended allowance. 1 bag of saline solution, a 1 liter bag of saline, has more than the daily recommended allowance of sodium chloride. And it's like, well, why does that make sense? Well, it doesn't. And that's why salt. Now, if you are in kidney failure or in your dialysis, forget everything I've said. Because if you don't have functioning kidneys, it's our kidneys that keep us alive, filter the blood, and they also keep our salt in balance. On a healthy kidney, you could eat, as long as you drink water, you could process twice that much salt per day in a healthy kidney. Nobody in their right mind would do that, but your kidneys can if they're healthy and you have water. So perhaps 100 grams of salt may be too much for the kidneys. This right here is 55 grams. And perhaps 100 is too much for a healthy kidney. So how do I get enough good salt? Well, the first thing you do is you get rid of all the, I call it the white poison. So you go home, you look at your cabinets, anything that has an ingredient label, set that aside. You don't have to throw it away. You can use it for all kinds of fun stuff, but just don't eat it. Make Play-Doh. There's some fun like Play-Doh recipes that you can make with salt. You can use it for killing slugs. You can use it to whatever you want to do, but don't eat it. And then there's a lot of great books on salt, and a lot of these books on water and salt, they'll tell you that most of us are dehydrated, which we probably are because we don't drink enough water, and we maybe drink soda or something instead of water, but I should drink about half my body weight in ounces as a minimum. So if I'm 150 pounds, at a minimum, I should drink 75 ounces of water a day. And if I'm just drinking distilled water, I am flushing my system of salts. And so Dr. Brownstein and many other health professionals, they would say salt your food liberally. It helps us digest our food, it helps it taste better. And if you salt your food liberally, and then you add a 1/4 teaspoon of salt to every quart of water that you're drinking, then you're going to come out about right. Which is interesting because you can go to the hospital, and if you're not drinking enough, you go to the hospital and they're going to give you an IV, which isn't a water bottle, it's going to be salt water. And then you get the bill, and it's going to be probably $300 or $400 for that 1 liter of salt water, and you can make it yourself at home. So I told you before that I'd give you a little recipe. So if you ever have the grandkids over, or you're going for a bike ride, or you want to just have something hot because you're working in the garden all day and you don't want to buy the pink stuff or the blue stuff at super expensive amounts, take a quart of clean water. So grab a mason jar, a quart of clean water, a 1/4 teaspoon of good clean salt, a squeeze of lemon, and if you want, you can add a little bit of honey or some fig or some little bit of natural sweetener, and you'll make the best electrolyte replacement drink for pennies on the dollar. Quart of water, 1/4 teaspoon of good clean salt, a squeeze of lemon. I like that on most days without any sweetener in it. Just alone, that tastes really good. But if you can add some sweetener to it as well. If you do, I like honey, but there's a lot of other ones you can do. So I oftentimes, and actually before the class started even, people said, hey, what about some of these other brands of salt? And I actually am really good friends with a lot of salt companies besides ours. I told you I was biased, I'll admit that up front. But there's 3 questions you need to ask. And if you ask these 3 questions, you will get a great salt product. It might be Redmond, it might be somebody else's, but these 3 questions will lead you to a great salt that's going to work for you. And I'd propose that these 3 questions should also hold true for anything else you're buying. If you walk into the store here and you're buying some whatever it is, maybe it's wheat or it's some freeze-dried whatever, these 3 questions, you're going to get a good product. So the first of that is who's producing it. In salt, it makes sense when we're thinking, hey, if I'm going to go buy some eggs, it's maybe easy to figure out who's producing those eggs. Maybe my neighbor has some chickens in the backyard. When it comes to salt, it's a lot harder. And so knowing who's producing it is really important because you can't get the answers to questions 2 and 3 unless you know the answer to question 1. And oftentimes with salt, if you walked into a big box store and you go and you just buy a 5-pound thing of salt, you have no idea who's producing it because it may just be gathered somewhere, dumped on the open market, shipped over in big shipping containers, transferability, traceability, almost impossible. First thing, know who's producing it. The second is what's the source. Now I would propose that's the same thing with your garden vegetables, right? So if you know who's producing, let's say we're talking peas, and if you know who's producing it, oh, it's the guy down the street. Okay, what's his source? Oh, it's his little organic farm in the backyard. What does he put on it? Nothing. He's never used Roundup Ready products on it. It is clean, it is great, and it's not right next to the nuclear facility or the plant or whatever. Great. So you know the source and you know who's producing it. And then you can ask the third question is what are they doing to it? Now with salt, that's really important because are we taking anything out? Are we putting anything in? And if you can find the answer to those three questions, whether you're buying a gallon of milk, you're buying a bag of freeze-dried peas, or you're buying salt, if you can know who's producing it, you can know the source, and you can know what they're doing to it, you're going to get a good product. With our oceans, we humans have not been the best stewards of this planet that we live on. And so unfortunately, you know, for those that remember Exxon Valdez, it didn't take too long for that up in Alaska to make it all the way down past Chile. Didn't take too long when we had the nuclear disaster in Japan to start washing up on the shores of California. It doesn't take long for the cruise ship that goes down in the Mediterranean to start polluting all over. And that's because water is the universal solvent. When I teach this class to kids, I use the swimming pool example. And even if you have a little kid that pees in the deep end, it doesn't take that long until the pool has trace amounts of it all over, and it kind of works the same way with water. And so if I was getting my salt from the San Francisco Bay or maybe the Gulf of Mexico, and then there's the BP oil spill, I'd probably want to stop getting my salt from that area, at least for an X amount of period of time. So, great, what are some possible good brands? Well, I would say not these. These are the ones we just kind of talked about before, and all these have additives. Yeah, they're cheap, but then you'd have to eat it. And so there's that. Now we get to Celtic. Celtic, owned by a lovely woman. Her name's Selena DeLange. She's actually a friend of mine. I was talking to her just yesterday. She gets her salt from the coast of Brittany, France. They produce salt the way our early ancestors would. So they take the salt from the Mediterranean, which is about 3% salt, and they line it in a gray clay lined pond. If you were to take salt water from the ocean and put it in a little pool on the beach, it's going to just disappear into the sand. But if I take a bentonite clay, for those that were here at my clay class or my dad's clay class a little while ago, clay, one of the properties of clay, it creates a barrier, and so the water can't get out. So by taking a clay lined pond and bringing that salt in and letting it sit, and then I rake up those salt crystals off the bottom of that pond, I'm getting this light gray colored salt, which is the salt from the Mediterranean and a little bit of that clay from France, and that's where I get that light gray color in Celtic salt. Great company. Of all of the gray salts, I would use Celtic. I know Selena, she does a great job. She's very nice, has all fair trade, does everything right, and that's Selena. Hawaiian salt, if you go to Hawaii, a fun souvenir, in Hawaii they actually make the salt the same way they do in the coast of Brittany, France, but instead of the clay being gray, like in Brittany, France, the clay is red. And there's this Hawaiian red clay. And so if you use that Hawaiian red clay and you bring the salt water in, max salinity is 26%. So you bring the salt water in, it's 3%, you cut it off, it starts to evaporate. 7, 8, 9, 10. At 26%, the water is max salinity. And so when it hits 27, the salt falls out of suspension onto the bottom of that pond. We rake it up with the gray clay and with the red clay, and then we have red Hawaiian salt. Has a dusty flavor. These are the ponds, very similar to the Celtic ponds, but they're red instead of gray. Now, smoked salt is really fun. Salt is hygroscopic. Now, we do have a smoked salt at Redmond. This is not ours, but there's two ways to make smoked salt. You actually, if you have a Traeger or whatever, you actually can smoke your own salt. Put a little salt plate out there. Next time you're smoking something, get the salt a little wet first because it's going to make it even faster, and just put it in there for 6 hours while you're making your whatever, and you'll have salt that's actually smoked. Now, some salt companies will actually use liquid smoker chemicals to coat the crystal with to boost that flavor, but you could do it yourself. But they're smoked salt. Now, Himalayan salt, there is a couple of deposits there's actually 3 main deposits that we know of where they're an ancient seabed settled off long before we had all of the pollution that we know today. And these ancient seabeds were trapped underground and pushed up. And so if you look at the mountain ranges in Utah, the plates have shifted and pushed up. And this salt deposit that was part of the Sundance Sea. So most people know Lake Bonneville. The Sundance Sea was eons before then. I wasn't alive then to confirm actually when it happened, but it was a long time ago. And long older than Lake Bonneville there's a sea called the Sundance Sea that covered all of Utah, parts of Colorado, parts of Montana, parts of Idaho. Massive sea. And that was before the Great Basin pushed up. So that was at sea level, because that's where this ocean flooded down from the Arctic, this massive sea, and it was at sea level. The Great Basin gets pushed up, and this salt that's deep within the earth, now buried under volcanic activity, it gets pushed up. So in the town of Redmond, near the town of Salina, named for Salina, which is Spanish for salt, there in Redmond, there's 3 red mounds that are behind the town, and under the town, there's this salt deposit that looks roughly like that because it's been pushed up. So sedimentary deposits should be horizontal, like a coal mine is horizontal. If you ever came down to the salt mine in Redmond, the strata is actually vertical, which makes it incredibly safe. If you have a 2x4 that's this way, you can jump on the center of it and snap it. If you have a 2x4 this way, you could jump till your heart's content, and you're not going to ever break that 2x4. And that's why salt is so much safer than a deposit that's sitting this way. This is a really unique deposit, and it just so happens that this deposit is sitting right under my grandfather's farm. Back in the 1950s, their farm wasn't doing too well, and so they thought, I got to do something to feed the kids and give the boys some work. And so the 2 brothers decided to dig down and hit the salt under their farm. My grandpa, during World War II, was a riveter for McDonnell Douglas. It was called Douglas Aircraft at the time. And his brother was a miner at Kennecott, the copper mine, during World War II. So after the war, they came back to the farm, to their dad's farm there in Redmond, to give a go at farming. And then by the 1950s, it was just kind of a drought and the farm wasn't doing so well. So that's how my family got into the salt business. And for those that met my dad, Neil, that's his dad, Milo, and his dad's brother that started the salt company. So that's Redmond Real Salt. And so I told you a little bit about the strata. You actually can see it right there in that picture. The deposit's about 1/4 mile wide. It's about 3 miles long and 5,000 feet deep. And so if you went right out here in the parking lot and drilled down 5,000 feet, you would hit that deposit. It actually covers all of Utah, parts of New Mexico, this big, massive deposit. It just so happens that it comes to the surface, which is similar to the Himalayan salt. Does the same thing in Pakistan and India and Nepal, and it does the same thing in Bolivia. So there's some Bolivia pink salt, and it's called Bolivian rose, and that is similar deposit, similar geologic time frame. It just happens there. So I'm a fan of all of those salts, and I think, yes, I'm biased, and Marcelo is too, and you can get it here in the store. But I think if you ask those questions, you're going to come up with a good salt. So to wrap up, I know I'm a little bit late, but it wouldn't be right to be at a food storage conference or presentation and not talk about salt and survival. Of course, salt's an essential electrolyte, food preservation, flavoring food, powerful cleanser, healer. In fact, if I'm at a restaurant and don't have my hand sanitizer with me and I've been whatever, I'll just take the salt from the kitchen table, because it's bad salt anyway. I'll keep mine in my pocket and save it for dinner, but I'll take their salt and put it on my hands, and I'll use that as a cleanser. Salt's a great cleanser, and so instead of using the chemical version of your hand sanitizer, just use the salt at the restaurant, put a little bit in your hand. It's abrasive, it breaks down some of that nasty stuff that might be in the cracks, and salt naturally kills whatever you've got on your hands, and so you're good to go. Now, how much should I store? So if I had to live a year and I couldn't go shopping and I couldn't go to any store, how much salt do I need to live? Well, at a minimum, assuming you get everything else right, you need 6 pounds of salt to keep you alive. Now, most people don't think about eating 6 pounds of salt because we're getting a lot of processed foods. But if we were gonna, together, we're gonna go to Galt's Gulch and we're gonna start over. Anybody remember Galt's Gulch? From the book Atlas Shrugged. So if we're gonna go to Galt's Gulch, we need to take salt with us. And at a minimum, every person is going to need 6 pounds just to live, because we don't have any other salt there. We got to preserve our food. We got to keep our bodies, which are saline solution, in motion. So I say 10 pounds and not 6, because I'm an athlete. I love riding my bike, and I actually did 25 miles yesterday in the mountains above Heber. I did 20 miles today. And so I am going through salt probably faster than maybe the average person might. So I'm going to have 10 pounds. But the average person should at least have 6. So that's why I put 10 pounds. Now, assuming that we're going to have to preserve our food and we don't have a refrigerator, I mean, maybe we have a generator that gets us through the first period of time. But if there was some EMP, we have no generation, and we're starting from square one, I'm going to need about 30 to 50 pounds of salt to preserve about 200 pounds of food. And so whether it's kimchis, sauerkrauts, fermented veggies, fish, squirrels, whatever I'm going to preserve, I'm going to need about 30 to 50 pounds per year to preserve a couple 100 pounds of food. Now, we might be lucky to live in St. George, and if I'm living in St. George, maybe I've got, for a period of time, I've got a lot more access than if I'm in Heber. So if I'm in Heber and my window of season, both for planting as well as preserving meats, I'm going to need more in Heber than you might if you've got animals that are around longer that you can access and preserve food with a longer growing season. So that's why it's 30 to 60 pounds. If you have a really narrow growing season and you've got a short ability to harvest, then you're going to want more salt because you have to preserve more of that year. But if you're living where if you're living in Hawaii and you've got great growing season and abundance of everything, then you probably could maybe even be 20 pounds total because you don't need to preserve that much stuff if you're living in Hawaii. But if you're living in Heber, where I live, you probably have to preserve more. So, and then outside of that, salt's a great way for an animal attractant. Any hunters know if you just follow animals, they will lead you to the salt deposit. So it may be that we move wherever we're moving and we watch the animals, and all the animals, lo and behold, are going to this water hole. Oh, great, now we know where the water is. And they all go to this little patch of earth and they're all pawing at it and eating the earth, and we push this, and they're like, oh my gosh, we're in Jericho, Kansas, we have our own salt mine. Or we're in Redmond, Utah, we have our own salt mine. But if we don't have that, that's what they suggest. And then, of course, it's always great, and maybe you teach classes on this, I have a lot of food storage at my house, and hopefully I can stay there if I ever had to use all of it. But if I ever had to leave my house, then I've got to start prioritizing what can I fit in my truck. And so if I'm thinking, hey, I'm not going to get out of Dodge, I'm going to stay, then what I store and what I keep might be greater than if I'm thinking, hey, when my kids, I got one kid in North Carolina, if it hits the fan, hopefully he gets back and I'll have the core with me and not with him as a recent college graduate. So anyway, I kind of beat that dead horse already, but that's about what, for food storage, and maybe Marcelo has a different formula, but that's what I use when I teach classes on the importance of salt. So some of my favorite books on salt. Just wrapping up here, these are some great books on salt. If you like the history of salt and you're kind of a history nerd, this book, Salt, A World History, is fascinating. It goes through all of the Romans, the Persians, the Greeks, all of the wars on salt, all that stuff I told you today, that comes out of this book called Salt, A World History. There's a book called The Salt Fix by Dr. James D. Nicolantonio. He references a lot of this Dr. David Brownstein's book called Salt Your Way to Health. Both of those books are based on the original salt and water guy, whose name was Dr. Batman Gelly. I used to be able to say Batman Gelly, and a lot of the health food people knew exactly who I was talking about. As it turns out, I'm getting older, so is everybody else. And most people don't remember Dr. Batman Gelly, and they know Dr. Brownstein or Dr. James D. Nicolantonio. So thank you for listening to me ramble. I will be glad to stick around for some questions. However, because you came, I brought a free gift for everybody. I gave you that recipe for making the best electrolyte in the world. Quart of water, quarter teaspoon of salt, squeeze a lemon, a little bit of honey. Now, that's great, but I'm an active cyclist, and when I'm running out the door to go biking, I don't want to do that every time, and so I'm kind of lazy. So we actually have a product at Redmond, we call it Re-Light, as Re-Electrolyte, and we take basically that formula I just gave you, and then we also add some extra potassium and magnesium and some coconut water powder. If we went back 500 years ago, or even 100 years ago, maybe not 100, 200 years ago, a lot of humanity, a lot of us would have eaten more foods with higher levels of potassium and magnesium, because we would have eaten a lot more seeds and a lot more nuts and a lot more broccoli and cauliflower and veggies that are naturally rich in those minerals. A lot of us, unfortunately, don't eat as well as we should. And so this electrolyte formula not only has the sodium, but it also adds a little bit of calcium, potassium, magnesium to help offset that. So there's, 7 sticks per bag, just a little variety. I think you have most of the flavors here on the shelf. But here's a free one to take home with you. There's a box of them here. Just grab one, or if your friend didn't make it, grab 2. And thanks for coming. And if you haven't attended my dad's clay class, the next time he does one, come and see his class, or I'll do a class on clay too.
And we do have a few. Can you turn up this mic? Thanks. We do have a few minutes left, so I'm going to open it up to questions. I do have one question from online that I'll pose to you. But just to let you know, wasn't that amazing? Like just learning salt,
you.
right? And it just, my brain's just going, man, there's just so much more to learn. And the things about salt, like just to let you know, my wife and I started changing our vocabulary this week because I've been studying health even more lately. You know, I ended up getting really, really chubby with all the stress and everything else with business, and I said, I'm done. And so in the last week, I went into hyperketosis, started eating really healthy every single day. After I got into that, I lost about 10 pounds in the last, not even a week now. And I'm just going to go for another 30 pounds until I lose it all. But what's interesting is this, that we're going to the store now, and we're not saying, hey, what food do we want to buy? We've changed our word. You know what it is? What fuel do we want to buy? Do you got that? Because what happens is you get this much nutrients in this much amount of food, it fills up your belly, right? But you get this, this much nutrients in this much amount of food, and it just changes the world for you. That's what we're talking about right here. Does that make sense? The relight, the salt, everything they have. I've probably got about 100 pounds of salt just for my food storage, and people say you're crazy. After his presentation, I'm starting to say I'm crazy. I need to have about 3 or 4 or 5 times that. Does that make sense? Salt is life, right? And so that changed my perspective because of what you taught, which I thought was awesome. Yeah, it was amazing. Thank you.
So before he asked that question, so one thing, because you did bring up dieting, and so our bodies, oftentimes when we think we're craving sugar, we're actually craving salt. And so the next time you have that sugar craving, at my house, I have a jar of the coarse salt. It's like the size of a peppercorn, but you could have whatever you have. But whenever I get a sugar craving, or I think, maybe a big candy bar sounds good, a pinch of salt under the tongue, or just putting one of those salt crystals in your mouth, that alone is most of the time extremely satisfying, because it's the body, we think it's sugar, but we are not craving sugar, we're actually craving salt. On top of that, you mentioned ketosis, so 1 gram, so in our bodies we have something called glycogen. So glycogen is the sugar that's running through our bodies. And for every gram of glycogen, 2 to 3 grams of water will attach to it. And so as we go into a fasting state or into ketosis, we're going to start losing, as that glycogen drops, we're also losing grams of water at the same time. And so people talk about the keto flu, or maybe you get fasting and start feeling sick when you start to fast. Oftentimes that's because you're dehydrated. If you're not drinking water during your fast, that even just complicates it more. But if you're drinking water and you're fasting, you're actually still losing water because you're losing glycogen, and the water is attached to the glycogen. And so because of that, you're losing water and salts. So the first time you feel like a headache coming on when you're fasting, or you think you're craving sugar, put a little bit of salt under your tongue. And if it's natural salt, it'll actually taste sweet. Just like when you're out in the garden, you come in, that first glass of water is amazing. The 5th glass of water is less amazing. Salt's the same way. So if you put a little salt crystal under your tongue and it tastes really good, and the next one tastes really good, and the third one tastes, that's a little salty, and the fourth one's like, okay, that's enough, that's a good indication. And same thing when you make your little electrolyte drink. When you make that up, you'll find that as your levels come up, it doesn't taste as good. Coconut water, a lot of people will experience the same thing with coconut water, because coconut water is a great electrolyte, and sometimes you might drink some coconut water and it's like, oh my gosh, that is amazing. Other times you're like, but it's oftentimes because of where our bodies are at. Just like when we think we're craving fat, because we are, we're not craving a Big Mac and a bunch of fatty fries. What we're craving is good, clean, healthy fats. Yeah.
Good nutrients. That's awesome. I love that. And that's one of the reasons why I'm doing salt early in the morning to start out the day, just to get going. But he taught me something about sleep. I don't sleep very well. And so I want to try the little 1/4 teaspoon and see how that works out. And I think that's amazing. Let's go a couple questions over here. Let's start over here. I'll go across.
When you put salt in, if I put salt in a plastic bottle, put your salt in a plastic bottle, is that harmful? Because salt does draw out other things, correct?
So the problem with plastics, especially when it heats up, is it releases BPA, right? And that's why I have BPA-free BPA, right? Salt doesn't change with heat, and so the salt wouldn't change, but if you have a water bottle that's in your car for all summer long, and you have salt in it, the salt itself isn't changing, but the water is. And so long term, I still think you're better off with like a stainless steel or glass or something that's not plastic, because it's not the salt, it's the other challenges with the plastic.
Two things. Why don't you write a book? Because yours is more like user friendly.
Well, thank you.
It's something that's understandable to the general public. Second, why don't you do those pods that they do online? What are they called? Those podcasts.
The thing is, he would get so popular it'd blow up the internet, and he's trying to serve. He's trying to save all you guys and all your kids who play video games, and so that's the reason why.
Thank you. I will. I haven't done it yet.
Quick question. Is it better to do salt in the morning or at night, or does it matter?
My understanding is it doesn't matter.
If you're doing it daily.
The best is to keep it consistent, because our bodies, some things you cycle through. Maybe if you're taking creatine or you're taking, some supplement with salt, the salt is the basis, and so I think there's very little. There's a lot of research on best times to eat, and some of that's confusing. Hey, do you eat one meal a day in the morning, or do you eat it at night? With water, that's not the case. There's no doctor that I've ever seen that would say only drink your water before bed or only drink your water in the morning. And so we want the salt evenly with our water. And so like my wife hates getting up to use the bathroom at night. And so she quits drinking water, in my opinion, probably earlier than probably she should, because she doesn't want to get up at night. And I mean, maybe there's a trade-off in, do I sleep or do I, get good salt? I don't know. But I think if we can keep that balanced, but because most of us are dehydrated before we get to bed, and then like my wife's case, she doesn't want to drink more water before bed, then she doesn't drink water or salt, and then then you get leg cramps, and then your body's not able to cleanse itself at night. So generally speaking, I think most of us could take a quarter teaspoon of salt in a glass of water before bed, not enough to make us have to get up all night, but that'd be a great way to kind of preset the body for sleep. Just like with a cold room, because our body, we fall asleep faster if our core temp drops a little bit. So cold sheet, even though we like a heated blanket, cold sheets in a cold room do help us fall asleep a little faster. And salt will help us reset that sleep as well.
I'll go a little deeper in my thoughts on that. First of all, you got to listen to your body. I mean, your body tells you a lot. And even in this diet, I'm always listening to my body. And one thing your body is saying is, the further in the day things get and the more stressed you get, there's scientifically proven that people start giving into addictions later on when they get exhausted or stressed or depressed or whatever throughout the day. And that's probably a good time to just go, see what happens before you start eating all the potato chips, before you start eating all the candy bars and cupcakes and everything else. Yeah. And so I think that's a good thing to try, just from what you brought up.
Okay, this is concerning my grandson. My grandson, he does track and football. So I think that I'm going to get another bag. I bought one earlier today. I'm going to get another big bag. So I have the storage for myself, but I want to I'm going to give a big bottle to him so he can enjoy the
Great
salt.
idea.
Would probably help him maybe.
Yeah, and the cheap way is just to put a quarter teaspoon in a quart of water. But for your son, your grandson, have him try some of these because it's just really easy. More expensive, but especially if he's heading to a track meet, maybe he doesn't have the time to make it all of himself. So he can take one of these either before his event or after and help replace those lost salts, especially for distance.
And your dad talked about that, where it was a bike ride thing he was talking about, right? The guy didn't have salt and he took it and he could keep going, right?
Yeah.
And so I thought that was really good. And by the way, those of you who are struggling with constipation, right? You just take a little extra salt, a lot extra salt, right? And it'll go right through you. Yeah, it'll take you right through just to be able to clear things out. There's a lot of things you can do with it. Let's go another one over here. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, right?
Hey, thank you very much. That was great
Thank you.
and true. Just one comment. I've used stainless steel for salt water, and chlorides are corrosive to stainless steel. It'll pit a hole right through it. It's concentration dependent, but as long as you keep it dilute, I would rather use glass or plastic.
Yeah.
Or carbonate bottles. That's all.
Yeah, they can. So 316 is your kind of your medical grade stainless. There's a lot of different grades of stainless, and 316 is generally known as like a medical grade stainless. But even that can have flaws in it. And so if you, like I've had a lot of relight in this one, and there's no pitting in this one, but there are bottles when you look at it that you'll see, pitting in. So yeah, the quality of that stainless does make a difference.
And you're probably not keeping the salt water in there all day long for years and stuff like that. So it's probably not.
Yeah, and interestingly enough with salt, so it's actually the oxygen that makes it corrosive. So if you come underground with us, so we have a piece, if we buy a piece of equipment like a loader that lives underground in the mine, in salt its whole life, it doesn't rust at all. But if a vehicle goes out of the mine and then back into the mine and then out of the mine, and now water's introduced and the oxygen is introduced out with the water, that's when it corrodes.
And people ask,
so having it open with salt in there continually would amplify that pitting.
and just on that point that he just made right here, it's interesting because people ask me what's the best salts out there, and I say, well, the best salts. I mean, locally it's Redmond salt, right? If you're to be, if over in India and stuff, you go Himalayan. One of the reasons for that is because it's inside the ground, right? What happens when it's outside? You're taking it from seas and everything else. What's happening with the pollution that's coming from the air? What's happening from the pollution that's coming from the seas and everything else? This is the cleanest we're talking about. I mean, it's amazing.
Two quick questions. The first one is when it comes to long-term storage of salt, what precautions do you have to take? The second quick question was your dad said something about when you're cooking, not to add salt before the cooking process. Can you elaborate on that?
Yeah, so the salt's been around a really long time, and it's funny, we put a shelf life on the salt, but it's eons old. It'll be around a long time. So there's that scripture that says, has salt lost its savor, and wherewith the earth be salted, or it's good for nothing to be trodden on the feet of man. The way that salt loses its savor is through contamination. And by, if you dump the bag out on the parking lot trying to pick all that back up, then that salt would have lost its savor because it's been contaminated. So salt won't go bad. The exception of, if you fill this bag right here, there's actually some clumps. Like there's a little bit of like a golf ball sized lump right there. Now I can push on it and it breaks it right up. But this bag is not 100% airtight. There's little holes in it. They're really small holes, so the salt can't get out. But if you put salt in a food storage bucket like this, and the oxygen doesn't get to it, then it's not going to absorb water out of the air.
What we have also is we always tell people do a gasket sealed lid. There's a gasket under here that makes it airtight. That's how I do my salt at home. I'm not going to take any chances of water getting in it.
So the water is the biggest issue. So if I have this down in my basement, just this bag like this, and it's just sitting there and nothing ever happens, that salt will be fine. Worst case scenario, I have to drop it on the floor and it kind of breaks it up a little bit. The problem that most people might run into is if there's ever a backflow or there's a flood or there's a water line that breaks, now you've just ruined all of your salt. And so the salt itself is fine, but I love the idea of a storage bucket, and whether you want to just put the bag in the bucket and smash it in there or you want to cut it and dump it in, however you want to do it. But for storage precautions, all you want to do is keep it away from water and other possible contaminations. Now, salt is very hygroscopic, but it also absorbs smells. And so if you had your salt in this bag out in the milk barn, when you open that salt, the salt would be fine, as far as clean, but there's a good chance it's going to have a little bit of a milk barn smell to it because the salt will absorb that smell. Or if you're in an apartment complex or something and your neighbor smokes and there's kind of that smoky coming through the walls or whatever, your salt can smell like, just like you can smoke salt, the salt will absorb smells. In fact, we actually don't do any of the seasoning blends in the same facility. So we have a garlic and an onion. But if you have salt in your facility, you have garlic in your facility, all the salt tastes and smells like garlic. And so, because it'll absorb smells. So as far as cooking goes, I think what my dad meant to say is if most people were to cook by flavor and not by recipe, they would actually get better salt for their body. And so sometimes, like, people say, well, I'm switching over, I'm going to make some potatoes and I'm going to make some bread. And it's my mom's bread recipe, and you'd use the exact same number of, scoops of salt that your grandma did, and the bread turns out way too salty. Because of the way this is a little bit stronger flavor, some people think it's a sweeter salt flavor. And so rather than following a guideline, if you can salt to taste, and really, to Marcelo's point, get used to listening to our bodies, we'll actually end up eating a lot healthier, both in terms of salt and fat. So when I started to clean up my diet, I found that I can hardly get enough olive oil. Before, I didn't like olive oil, and that's all I put on salads now. I don't use any dressing. I just use salt and olive oil, and I've got a pool of olive oil on the bottom of that plate, and it tastes so good because I'm not getting some of the fats that I used to get in my diet from my other less good foods. But now that I've kind of cleaned that up, olive oil just, man, I can't. Yeah. So I'm like, scooping it all in. And so I think listening to our bodies for salt is equally important.
Awesome. Okay, we have a couple other questions. There was one online that says, do you know anything about Meniere's disease where you're not supposed to take salt or you get sick?
I've researched it, but not enough to just extemporaneously talk about it. POTS is one we hear a lot, but everybody's body reacts to everything differently. So to that one, I'd say talk to your healthcare professional. And same thing with dialysis and kidney failure. Healthy kidneys can process a lot of salt. Non-healthy kidneys, different story. So
let's go up here.
So, a quarter teaspoon of salt under your tongue at night. Do you have to drink the water afterwards?
You wouldn't have to, but most people like that as a chaser because a quarter teaspoon is quite a bit. And so it would be pretty salty. Now you could put like an 1/8 or a 1/16 and then just go to bed with it under your tongue and you might find that's just fine. But most people, it's salty enough that you'd want to chase that with something. Or, yeah, mix it in like a little cup of tea that you could just hot water and a little bit of salt.
Does Redmond have the larger crystals like Celtic salt does? Because that's what I usually do is take a couple of grams before I take a glass of water.
Yeah, so we do, and Marcelo could certainly bring it in the store.
Yeah, we can order it anytime you need it.
We have 4 different sizes. We have a coarse size that you'd put in like a coarse grinder to grind your own. So my wife likes to have a pepper grinder and a salt grinder. Pepper grinders actually make sense because if you crack a peppercorn, it is fresher. Salt doesn't get any fresher if you crack it, but she likes to have matching ones. And so we have a salt and a pepper grinder. If you are going to grind salt, you just want to make sure it's ceramic. Because if there are grinders that are plastic tops, like if you go and buy a little spice thing at the grocery store and it has a plastic grinder, you'll actually grind any plastic grinder like that. You're actually grinding plastic into the food. And with salt, that's even more so because salt is harder than plastic. And so if you are going to get a grinder, I'd get a nice ceramic grinder for salt particularly.
So a couple online, how would you actually preserve meats with salt?
So with salt, you have to, the goal is to remove the water activity. And so water activity is a chemistry term that determines how fast something rots because of the moisture in it. And so whether you smoke it or salt it, what you're trying to do is remove the water activity. And so if you ever go to a Jewish restaurant, if you went to a Jewish restaurant and you ordered a piece of meat, it actually tastes, it's usually thinly cut and it tastes pretty salty. And I like salt, but they do that so the salt can penetrate. You can do the same thing with a fillet of fish. You actually can cure a piece of fish with just salt. And so if you had like a nice salmon fillet, you can just cake it in salt, leave it for a couple of days, and it'll actually, that salt will pull all of the water out of that piece of salmon. Yeah, it's almost like...
The question
like,
was, does it tenderize it?
It's almost like smoked, if you ever had smoked salt or smoked salmon, kind of the same way, almost a cross between smoke and ceviche. Now, I like fermenting my own veggies. So my dad really likes sauerkraut, and I like kimchi, but my name's Daryl, so I call it Daryl-chi. But what I do is I take a couple of heads of cabbage, and I will dice them into strips, and then, so I've got a big granola bowl. I call it my granola bowl, but it's my kimchi bowl. And so I'll do 2 heads of cabbage, and then I take a tablespoon of salt and sprinkle over the tops of it. And then I use my hands. You can buy like mallets, but it never works as good as your hands. And then just bruise that. And then I let that sit. And then I chop all my veggies. And I really love in my sauerkraut, I love carrots. I like green peppers and Anaheim peppers and cauliflower. And I'll do radishes. And so I dice them. And so I like the crunchiers. So like with my cauliflower, I'll just break the little heads off. So each, they're like this size and smaller. And then with my carrots, I'll just cut them in rounds. And then while I'm doing all of that, and I come back over, and by then this bowl, there's standing water in it, because once you bruise it, it sucks all that water out. And then I'll dump my veggies on top of that and mix it all together. And that will make about 3 half-gallon quart jars. And then I just smash that in there, and then I got a little airlock. Do you sell airlocks here?
We don't, but
I can send you some, and I'll send Marcelo my recipe. And
that would be a good thing, Celeste, for us to start carrying, because that's something I like to do at home as well.
Yeah,
so.
food preservation is really fun, and whether you do, and I'm sure my dad would be happy to send you his sauerkraut recipe. I think mine's way better, but we share. He sends me a sauerkraut, and I give him my fermented veggies.
Daryl-chi, yeah,
Daryl-chi.
That's awesome. Let's go back here. We got a question.
I just get it at Harmon's.
Your salt, you said garlic salt.
Oh, so we have garlic salt that Marcelo could order for the store. We use organic freeze-dried garlic and then add salt to it. And so a lot of the seasonings on the market today will add flavor enhancers or sugars. So if you went and bought like a Lowry's seasoning or some other ones, oftentimes they'll have other things added to it. Because if you have this processed refined salt, it actually, if you taste them side by side, the processed salt has a sharp bitterness to it. And so because of that, a lot of those seasoning salts will add sugar to them. But we'll use organic freeze-dried garlic and then add just the regular salt to it. So there's no other additives in
And
it.
just to let you know, I mean, the type of things you can get, like clay toothpaste and salt, like all types of salt and garlic salt and everything else, they're amazing. And if you guys have the desire for them, obviously we treat members really well and give you guys great prices, right? And so if you guys have a desire for that, just talk to Celeste, and if we have enough people wanting things, we'll start carrying it here to help our members. Does that make sense? Okay. Let's go one more question. We got to wrap it up. Okay.
This is quick. I understand Redmond have tours that they offer. Can you tell us a little bit about those, and if there's a timing that we need to get there too?
It's a great question. So if you go to redmondincorporated.com, we actually have a mind tour button. I'll have to find it. we used to not be able, up until just more recently, we couldn't do any mine tours for a couple of reasons. So we're regulated by MSHA. And so years ago, my grandpa wanted to do these mine tours and thought it would be really fun. And then we talked to the insurance company and they're like, yeah, no. And so for a long period of time, we didn't do any tours other than for dignitaries, like this, maybe the state of Utah says, hey, would like to come down, or maybe the University of Utah. So we would do some special tours for, they're not really special people, but special tours for a limited number of people. However, we've started to do some preset tours occasionally with a set group. And so if we have one of these set groups and we have a few spots, then other people can kind of sneak in onto those spots. And I unfortunately don't know exactly on the website where that is, but you can occasionally, before we would just say no, but now there are some spots occasionally that you could get in if you played your cards just right. But I don't have, and that's not a very good answer, but the answer is not no anymore, so that's the good news. But I don't know exactly what that process is, other than I know there's a spot on the website that you can click and sign up for the next opportunity.
Awesome. And I probably should have said last question here. There was one more online that they've been waiting. Does taking salt affect anyone on hypertension medications negatively?
So I'm not a doctor, and so obviously I can't discuss specific medical concerns. However, with that being said, almost everybody that's on hypertensive drugs will still, when they go to the hospital, the first thing they're going to do is they're going to get an IV of saline solution, which is salt water. And so generally speaking, it's not the salt that's the problem, it's the chemicals in the other diet and the lack of other minerals that are impacting it. And so with that one, I would say, hey, great question. Best solution would be to take one of these books or take some of these things we talked about tonight to your next appointment and say, hey, I was reading and thinking about it, and I know that you've told me in the past to watch my salt, but yet when I'm in the hospital, I get an IV of saline solution, which is salt. So how do those things add up? And push back a little bit and take a little bit more ownership in our medicine. That said, I mean, somebody might be on hypertensive drugs and they might have kidney failure and dialysis, so it's hard to say, one thing, but generally it's not the salt, it's the totality of our full nutrition. So I know that's not a clear answer, but that's about all I got.
That's perfect. So we are out of questions, but is that okay? All right, so, okay, perfect. So we do need to wrap up. I want you to know that we've been playing around with salt in a lot of different ways. When you make soap, you use a lot of times lye. You can make soap lye from salt and water. You put it through electrical chemical situations, sodium hydroxide. Any of you guys tried this from last week? Okay, so we have a few people that tried the deodorant we came out with that was made out of salt, vinegar, and water. And can anybody testify for how many days, how well it's working? You want to? Go for it.
I don't dare say how many days it's been working, but it is. I usually sweat in certain places, and I'm not doing it.
Yeah. The thing is, I've got a lot of people trying it right now. All our team pretty much is doing it. Most of our team is doing it. I went 3 days. I sweated and everything. Mark, have you been using it? Have you tried it yet? Okay, you got sold out. You didn't get a chance to get it. But you want to try? Come over. You can.
So I have been using it, and then yesterday I couldn't find it, so I just used my regular deodorant, and by the middle of the afternoon I was stinking.
Yeah. So I've gone 3 days with this, and I went jogging for about 2 hours, tried to sweat, and I went 3 days, and it did pretty well. And I mean, it takes out the smell and everything, but we're talking salt, clean, 120 times more powerful at killing bacteria than bleach, and it's completely safe. You can spray it in your mouth. I mean, can you grab that bottle? I mean, this is the stuff I'm making with electrical chemical reactions with salt, vinegar, and water. And watch this. Ready? I just drank it. Okay, you want to smell it? Smell it, okay? Right in his mouth, okay? I take it when I'm sick and everything else, but salt. I mean, we're talking salt. That's how powerful and amazing salt is. So Yeah, exactly. I take it when I'm sick and everything else. My friend took this and put it on his tree that had fungus, and it started killing the fungus on it naturally. Okay, so many different things. But we're going to go into that. Hopefully next week I'm going to do a presentation on sanitation and everything else, and I'll go more into this, explaining the science a little bit more. But anyway, in a nutshell, salt is awesome, and you should be getting a ton of it. And Daryl is amazing. So please thank him one more time.
Thank you. Come and take one. I don't know if everybody takes one. I'll have plenty. If you have a really important friend that wasn't here, that was really wanted to be here, you can take two. But if everybody takes two, then there's not going to be enough for everybody. So.
And just to let
Use
you
your
know,
own judgments.
also, we only have 12 bags of salt right here. If we run out, and you guys want to get some more, we have more at the warehouse. So just let them know.
Yeah.
So I'm curious, does distilled water in a CPAP machine have an effect? Because I'm probably only breathing in half
Yeah.
a cup of distilled water a night.
That's good.
That's okay.
Yeah, because you're doing that for, so you're adding humidity, so you don't dry your lungs
Right.
out.